This is a portfolio submission for Alex Kolar. I'm a fourth year student in postgrad Unit 18. The project is called Calvido de Pacha, which translates as Council of Earth, and my studio tutors are Isaac Block and Ricardo de Ostos. This document contains some interactive elements, so wherever you see an image which has an orange border or text which has an orange background with white text, that means it's a hyperlink to another part of the document. So the unit this year is based in Colombia, and I've just included a kind of snippet of the unit brief, and it's looking at culture and how culture can be a dynamic force. So how I define culture, so the culture is the unique traits and identity of a certain group of people. With the Miska especially, culture is a fragile concept, therefore re-establishing their identity is key. So the proposal ambition, I'm kind of establishing the Miska's identity within a Spanish culture. The project will develop an architectural language based on an understanding of the Miska's historic spiritual beliefs. So I'll talk more about the Miska in a second. The project itself is a proposal for a council building and a public library. The architecture is used here as a tool to explore how the Miska can redefine their identity within the contemporary context of Spanish culture. So the Miska were a pre-Columbian indigenous society, and what I was interested in especially was a couple of things: their kind of pottery craftsmanship, their connection to the land, and ritual practices. And this diagram is just taken from a Miska piece of jewellery, and it looks at their social hierarchy. So the centre is Pachamama, which is Mother Earth. The second one is where the wise Miska would stand. The third concentric ring is where the Miska community who are learning to be wise Miska would stand. And the outer ring is where people who would want to be part of the community would stand. Especially what I was interested in was their pottery and craftsmanship, so they had very intricate and quite delicate ceramic pieces, which I thought was quite interesting. So their historic distribution was broken down, I guess, into an early Miska period and then a late Miska period. And then this is just a zoom in looking at their settlement patterns from early Miska period in the sort of 600s to around 1600 before the Spanish conquest. I then got interested in how the Spanish actually encountered the Miska. So this diagram explains the different territories of the Miska that the Spanish conquistadors encountered. And what was quite interesting actually was that Columbus signifies not a person per se for the indigenous people of Colombia, but actually an idea, which is the harsh conquest of the indigenous people. I then just looked at Plaza de Bolivar, which is the first square in what is now Bogota, and the colonial, how the square has become a colonial metaphor for harsh colonial rule, essentially. I then began to codify colonial characteristics of architecture, so the mass, the building division, the materiality, columns, the windows and the doors. So what I'm taking forward is their Miska's ritual practices. I was quite interested in that. I was also quite interested in the earthenware materiality. I want to take that forward in the project, and also the codifying colonial architectural elements and taking that forward. So the polemic. So as I said previously, establishing an identity through understanding the Miska's spiritual beliefs. I believe that cultural identity is represented architecturally in three ways. So spatially, again, the notion of the square, how a kind of urban realm was planned, reveals an identity of that culture. Linguistic identity, the kind of formal language of the buildings, and then the material identity has a sort of narrative and identity with that. Establishing an architectural language, so my project one looked at how I would re-evaluate these kind of three identities that I set up in the previous page, and I was quite interested and inspired by this rock formation. So I looked at Miska mythology and their importance with water, and then began to connect it with this erosive process. So material identity, re-establishing that, so actually taking that Miska mythology and that importance of water and creating spaces with that. Spatial identity, which I guess goes against that linear grid system imposed by colonial rule, and there's more flowing, experiential planning. And then linguistic identity, again this term 1 and exploration, the language was derived from erosive process of form finding. This page then just looks at the Colombia trip. So we got to visit the Miska Calbido, the existing one in Suba, which is North Bogota. This is the political structure. So the Calbido, Miska Calbido, actually sits quite low in the sort of political structure up to the presidency and the Senate. And then their role in the community I was quite interested in as well. This page just looks at how they actually operate and the architecture that they inhabit. So they actually rent spaces. They don't actually have a building themselves. So the orange is the existing colonial buildings which they inhabit. So they have a library and office, gathering and performance space, and an office reception. The blue is then what they've created themselves. So I thought that was quite interesting. This is my reflection. So I've actually gone again. I had an original statement of what I thought establishing identity was, and then I've redefined that post Colombia trip. So material identity has gone from kind of natural form finding to a kind of reinterpretation of colonial elements. Spatial planning has kind of working with the square rather than going against it, and linguistic identity is then derived from reinterpreting elements. So these, what I've codified before, I've kind of re-established. So the building identity has changed, material identity, the column, and the door and window language. I was then specifically interested in the roof tile and how the geometry changes essentially if you add a different function. I thought that was quite interesting. So these were initial design ambitions. So I've designed a tile and began to implement it spatially. And then this is a kind of snippet looking at how the tile could become an enclosure and that sort of atmospheric condition that creates. The program of my council looks at two main things, so health and linguistics. So there will be a library and an archive, and then there'll be a public Miska garden and sort of drying spaces and packing in a market. And there'll be public and private elements. So the public element is on the ground floor, and then private elements are also on the ground floor, but then mainly on the first floor. So the site is in, as I said before, Suba. So there are actually two urban calbidos, Miska calbidos. So calbido is the Spanish word for town council. So there's one in Bosa, and the one I'm looking at is in Suba. I then just zoom in, so where my site is. So the darker orange is where the Miska calbido is, and the lighter orange is the Suba central square. This is just some analysis looking at the materiality of the existing site and the typologies. So this is a zoom in of the site, so it's Suba central square is here. The blue is the existing calbido, which I showed previously, so this is an existing colonial building, and the orange is my proposal for where the my Miska building will be, the Indigenous Council, Permanent Indigenous Council. This orange is then a proposed Miska garden as well, so I'm kind of re-establishing an identity within this square. I then began to do a similar process of codifying colonial elements around the existing context itself. So these are just the existing elevations, and I'm picking out elements to reinterpret. Some site images. So this is my site here, which is here. So then the proposal. So I began to look at the etymology of my title. So it's actually an amalgamation of a Spanish word, which is council, calbido, and a Miska word, pacha, which means earth. So it literally means council of earth. And I began to become interested through my research previously with earthenware materials. This is then an implementation of earthenware materials. I then developed a series of tiles based on my analysis of the site and what the Miska would need. So the library would need diffused light, so there was tiles which related to diffusing light and partitions of spaces. Briefly looked at precedents. So this is a Spanish warehouse which employs tiles not just as reclaimed tiles for partition walls, and then this office space in Australia again uses reclaimed tiles for the facade as a light screen, but also as a kind of bookshelves. That was quite interesting, the kind of reinterpreting the tiles function. Design principles, so I've got the 4 main tiles, and then I've the simple design principle of concave would mean seating, reading or quiet, and convex would mean a communal or shelving or storage. These diagrams just explore how the tile, when it scales up, could symbolize different things. This image looks at a conceptual render of how the tile could become a wall, a roof, an arch, or a floor. So this is a different scale, looking at how it could become a seat, handrail, or a table. These then begin to look at the spaces that I require, so corridors, individual seating, and how that tiles form informs that geometry, and then how I begin to put those elements together. So for example, the tile is a shelf, and what that form that creates. Again, the approach to the site, I've got 2 main spaces, so the library and courtyard space. Courtyard connects the 2 roads in red. The library space is closer to the government building, which is in blue. The secondary performance space is then closer to the school, which is here in orange. This is the massing in its context, so you have the main courtyard and the main library. The archive connects into this existing building, creates a link, and then the massing drops down as the site slopes down towards the school, and then the school is able to use part of this sort of performance space, so this kind of sharing of functions. So here I'm just codifying then my proposal. So again, with the building division, there's a clear division between wall and roof. A lot of openings are usually curvilinear, and then, for example, there's a kind of continuous building materiality, which wasn't the case for existing classical, I guess, colonial architecture, where the roof is clearly defined as something separate from the walls. This diagram then, I guess, breaks down the series of elements that make the building, and also just explores how the tiles form creates these elements, but then also their purpose defines their form as well. So for example, the tile wall is derived from, the wall is derived from the tile, but then the opening requires an opening, so that's also derived from this form. The columns and light wells are much more slender. And then the roof geometry is quite interesting. So it's derived from a kind of the form of the tile, it's extruded, but then it creates a sort of more open plan first floor element, and then it has these moments where it frames. So if you imagine the squares here, it frames the square quite nicely. So this view is taken in the external courtyard, and you can see the tile is the light screen. This is in the main library space. This is in the performance space. So the change in material here and the colour denotes that there's a performance space, and then it goes back to the orange. This is the courtyard, so the narrative behind this is that they're setting up for a Miska ritual, a celebration of the harvest festival in the early morning. And the landscaping is sort of derived from that initial diagram about the concentric rings. So in the middle is the Pachamama, which is represented by this sort of abstract sculpture.